Salutations! First, I want to thank all of you who have subscribed. Between the last video and this one, the channel has passed 1,000 subscribers. Woohoo! Anyway, on to business. I thought that I'd do something different today, and make a video specifically for the people who believe that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, or as I call them, the anti-monogamists. I recently read an article by Brian Hales, published in 2017 by Interpreter, a journal of Mormon thought. In the article, Brian attempts to refute the arguments of the monogamists, those who claim that Joseph Smith did not practice polygamy. It's an excellent example of the tactics that anti-monogamists use to convince people that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. In the spirit of Hugh Nibley's excellent presentation, How to Write an Anti-Mormon Book, I will address this video to the anti-monogamists to show them the most effective techniques to convince people that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. 1. Misrepresent your opponent's argument. Brian states that there are people who advocate the position that Joseph Smith did not practice plural marriage. So far, so good. Then he claims that these people generally admit that Brigham Young practiced plural marriage. It doesn't matter if there are any who dispute that point. The generally already makes it seem like his opponents are a little unhinged. Then Brian wisely lists not any quotes from the monogamists setting forth their argument, but his understanding of their argument. He starts off correctly stating that the monogamists argue that most historical evidence supporting Joseph as a polygamist was written years, decades after his death, and that there are no documented children fathered by Joseph Smith with a plural wife. Then he starts inserting his own bias into his opponent's arguments. Note the insertion of keywords that are certainly not part of the arguments any serious monogamist makes. That Section 101 of the D&C purportedly condemns polygamy. Joseph Smith reportedly repudiated polygamy. Emma Smith purportedly denied that Joseph practiced polygamy. The provenance of Section 132 is supposedly uncertain. The clever usage of these loaded words enables Brian to hide the fact that all the points are factually correct, and the monogamists simply have a different interpretation of the facts. By the time Brian gets around to discussing the issues, the reader has already been primed to regard the monogamists' arguments as nonsense, no matter their merits. 2. Use volume of sources to compensate for the weakness of individual sources. Brian is an expert at this in both overt and subtle ways. He appears reasonable and conciliatory when he agrees with the monogamists that most of the supportive evidence was penned years later by polygamists in the West who experienced life in Nauvoo and understandably had strong biases. Then he cunningly asserts that the question is whether the chronological remoteness and narrative prejudice are sufficient to dismiss the entire lot of testimonials. Of course, that isn't the question at all. The correct question is whether each account stands or falls on its own merits. Whatever happens, don't let your readers ask that question. Do not critically examine creation date, internal consistency and plausibility, the possible motives and biases of the author, revisions to their story over the years, and other things that a serious historian would do. Of course, the serious historian would then compare each account with all the other accounts of the same event, examining for possible correlations and contradictions. So I repeat, do not even hint about that. It would give up the whole game. But you have very little to worry about. Rather than doing the work themselves, most readers will be more than happy to take your word that the accounts as a whole must be either accepted or rejected en masse. 3. Use claims of polygamy as evidence of polygamy. This is an especially important technique. One might call it the bread and butter of the whole anti-monogamist game. Brian starts this in a section called Contemporaneous Evidence. Is the evidence a document written by Joseph, a speech or journal entry where he mentioned his alleged plural wives or endorsed polygamy? Certainly not, because no such evidence exists, and Brian opens with a clever dodge about why there is no real evidence. The evidence is people claiming that Joseph was a polygamist. To kill any curiosity about the veracity of the sources, simply state, as Brian does, that most of them are credible. How many and what makes them credible is something you should not deign to discuss. Remember, you're the authority here. Brian uses an unusually brazen trick in this article. He has a long section titled Later Recollections, which, as you'd expect, is full of later recollections of Joseph Smith's alleged polygamy. The next section, Evidence Joseph Smith Practiced Plural Marriage, begins, besides teaching and assisting with plural marriages, much evidence exists that Joseph himself was sealed to plural wives. But this evidence consists almost entirely of later recollections, just like the previous section. Yet with such a bold introduction, the unwary reader will never suspect that you are parading a bunch of gossip as evidence. A related rule is to treat all sources that support your argument as valid, no matter their provenance or biases. Learn from Brian's example. He does not question, therefore encouraging the reader to not question, if the disgraced serial adulterer John Bennett, whose secret prostitution ring was exposed by Joseph and who wrote a book and went on a nationwide campaign telling false stories to discredit Joseph, might have also invented the stories of Joseph's polygamy. Oh, the only question Brian presents to the reader is who Bennett found out from. Bennett's stories are buttressed by additional stories from decades after Joseph's death. To stop your reader from asking the obvious question of whether the later stories were based on Bennett's fabrications and not the other way around, simply assert, as Brian does, that the later stories are from credible witnesses, a category whose criteria you should take care to never specify. In another section, Brian recounts what he frames as a revelation dictated by Joseph Smith. It certainly appears authoritative, and Brian wisely does not mention that this document first appears in a typewritten letter in 1912, and that there is no original. We certainly don't want people to start asking questions about that. Brian also uses the very handy appeal to William Clayton's journal as a contemporary source. This is a very important tactic, because the average Mormon, anti-Mormon, and even historian doesn't know that the alleged journal has never been made available by the LDS Church for examination, only carefully selected and redacted excerpts from a document whose authenticity your readers have no way at all to verify. Number 5. Twist evidence against you into evidence for you. It should go without saying that you should only mention evidence contrary to your position if you can actually make it work for your position. This can be done by some artful omissions. For instance, don't mention Emma's repeated denials of and condemnation of polygamy while Joseph was alive. Rather assert that the later denials she gave were either because she was confused or because her zealous son twisted her words. The average reader will accept this legerdemain as the truth. Brian takes this tactic to another level in the case of Martha Brotherton, whose accusations against Brigham Young and Joseph Smith are given by Brian as contemporary evidence of polygamy. The fact that Martha never had any proof, and that both Joseph and Brigham vehemently denied the accusations, are glossed over by saying the accuracy of the report is subject to debate. To stop anyone from wondering about the other side of that debate, Brian follows up by saying that the authenticity is supported by other later historical data. The average reader will never notice that the example Brian gives for the authenticity of the Brotherton event does not mention Brotherton at all, and was altered during the revision of the Church's history. We'll discuss that soon. Then, in an almost unbelievably brazen paragraph, Brian accuses his opponents of a superficial evaluation of historical manuscripts. One is awed at the expertness at which Brian Hales crafts his sophistry. Another important rule: whenever possible, state your conclusions as historical fact, rather than presenting the facts and letting the reader judge. For instance, say, Desdemona Fuller married Joseph Smith in July 1843, rather than saying, almost 25 years after Joseph Smith's death, under intense pressure from her church leaders, Desdemona Fuller claimed that she had married Joseph Smith in July 1843. The latter statement is far more precise, but might raise uncomfortable questions for the anti-monogamist narrative. The Desdemona account leads us right into another rule: be flexible with your sources. Often you'll find that some sources are much more convincing if you leave out inconvenient details, or only refer to them in footnotes. As you can see, the profession of Desdemona's alleged marriage is followed up with a very convincing quote from her. It's just the right touch. But if you click on the footnote, you can see that Brian's source is not Desdemona's autobiography, but a quote from D. Michael Quinn's papers, which is alleged to come from an unknown autobiography, one that hasn't been located. Quinn himself couldn't recall any details about the alleged autobiography, although he was confident of the accuracy. How Quinn could be confident of the accuracy without being able to remember any details about it is hardly important. What's important is that it helps you tell your story. Another very illustrative example is when Brian says that on October 23, 1843, Brigham Young wrote in his journal, "With Elder H.C. Kimball and George A. Smith, I visited the prophet Joseph, who was glad to see us. He taught us many principles illustrating the doctrine of celestial marriage, concerning which God had given him a revelation." Yet if you care to look up the reference in Brian's footnote, you do not find Brigham Young's journal, but the journal History of the Church compiled by the Church History Department, with a newspaper clipping containing the text, and a pencil notation claiming that it's from Young's journal. However, you can be almost certain that nobody will follow the footnote, or have the temerity to question the Church History Department. After all, they're the experts. It's even more certain that nobody but a crazy conspiracy theorist would actually check Brigham Young's journal and see that he wrote nothing about celestial marriage on that date. Brother J. Smith felt well, was glad to see us, went to council with brethren in the afternoon. It's very easy to capitalize on people's ignorance of the revisions made to church history. Another weakness that should be exploited as often as possible. Rule 8. Never give your opponent any credit, even when they are obviously correct. You might think this would be difficult, but all you have to do is talk about how they might not be correct. An excellent example of this is the section, "No documented children fathered by Joseph Smith with a plural wife." This, of course, is true, but Brian doesn't give an inch to the monogamists. He argues that 1. This isn't really surprising, and we shouldn't really expect there to be children, although of course everyone, including Brian himself, did expect it before DNA evidence showed otherwise. And 2, that there still could be children we don't know about, so this monogamist argument isn't even valid. Brian clinches it when he says, "The absence of documented births is not evidence that no such births occurred." With that astonishing triple negative, Brian makes his argument unfalsifiable, since it's impossible to provide evidence of a birth not happening 200 years ago, implying the superficially plausible, yet patently ridiculous position that the lack of any evidence for his argument is actually a strength. If that sounds like too great a mess of contradictions for the reader to swallow, then carefully study Brian's method. He quickly transitions from the lack of evidence for any children to the alleged evidence for sexuality. The incautious reader will marvel at the evidence, not realizing that the subject has been changed. Always interpret language in your favor, even if it's inconsistent. For example, when Joseph's alleged wives give evasive euphemisms like "lived with Joseph Smith as his wife," or that they were his wife in very deed, interpret this as clear and obvious confirmation of sexual relations. But when Joseph is reported to say, "What a thing it is for a man to be accused of having 7 wives when I can only find 1," claim, as Brian does, that Joseph is clearly using creative language to dodge the truth of his polygamy. Brian even artfully combines this rule with the conclusions as fact rule, saying that Joseph had been sealed to over 24 women at this point, rather than saying the precise truth, that decades after his death over 24 women would claim they had been sealed to him before that date. Rule 10. Don't be afraid to use contradictory information. Naturally, given the nature of the evidence, this is almost unavoidable, and might get an incautious author into trouble. A useful trick is to have the contradictory evidence spaced far apart, so your reader is less likely to put 2 and 2 together. Again, Brian gives us a useful example. On page 119, he tells us that polygamy was a clandestine practice that people hardly dared to speak of. That's why there are no real contemporaneous sources, you see. But by page 146, to establish the authenticity of section 132, Brian recounts that Joseph allegedly has his scribe reading section 132 to groups of people, and it's a topic of group discussions, and Emma Smith is spilling the details of Joseph's wives on the public streets. Those 30-odd pages of distance make all the difference. If you spin it well enough, the average reader will never notice. If you're afraid that the contradictions will be too close together, touch as lightly upon the contradictory material as possible. And if you can employ a little creative editing to muddy the waters, all the better. For instance, as buttresses for the authenticity and veracity of 132, Brian uses both William Clayton's recollections and Horace Whitney's important document story. The radical discrepancy between the amount of time that it took these men to accomplish a task might cause a reader to ask unpleasant questions. Instead of a letter Clayton wrote where he describes that it took 3 hours to write the revelation, as Joseph dictated it slowly, Brian uses one of Clayton's affidavits, where it just happens In the AM. Brian carefully sets the vague AM against Helen Kimball's record of her father's journal, where she writes that copying an important document, which Whitney does not say was 132, took Whitney the greater part of the day and into the night, which is a stretch, but still believable. Unlike Whitney's actual journal, where he says that copying this important document took him the greater part of the day and night. Adding a photograph of Whitney's journal against the transcript of someone else's misquote of his journal is a brilliant stroke of audacity. Sadly, I've only been able to include 10 rules and a few examples in this video. There are many others, such as saying that Joseph's denials don't count, since he never specifically condemned celestial plural marriage, a term that didn't exist until long after Joseph's death, or interpreting Joseph Smith III's speculations about his potential relationship to possible plural wives of Joseph Smith into evidence that Joseph III secretly knew the truth about polygamy. I encourage you to read Brian's article, a link in the description, since it really is a masterclass in lulling readers into an unthinking stupor while making them feel very intelligent. And as an anti-monogamist, whether LDS or anti-Mormon, an unthinking stupor is exactly what you want to evoke. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like it, no hard feelings. See you next time.